Hello, and welcome to Wednesday's edition of Politics at Jack and Sam's Daily, the podcast that means you don't have to put on a crown and a cape and drive down the mall in a carriage to find out the government's plans for the year ahead.
Certainly don't. My name is Sam Coates from Sky News, and with me is Jack Blanchard of Politico, where we are looking forward to the first King's Speech of a Labour era and only the second of the Carolian era. That means it's under King Charles's reign.
I think there was a King's Speech in the 1920s, wasn't there, Sam? Some sort of king, old king talking about Ramsay MacDonald's plan for government, surely. Still, it's been a while. It's been a while since we've seen Labour have a moment like this. And it's a funny day in Westminster, as Sam knows well. We've seen a few of these now in our time being grey-haired elders of the lobby. Whitehall's cleared. The helicopters are taking off. They clear the airspace over central London, and they have all these weird ceremonies that are going to play out through the morning on your TV screens if you're geeky enough to watch them.
But before we get to that, it's not the only thing that's happening today that has pomp and ceremony. And I wish actually that there was a kind of the glitter balls and the ticker tape cannons in Westminster that there are over in Milwaukee. But there is an American style bit of pageantry there too with the Republican convention. So Jack, do you want to just go through what our top three things are today?
Yeah, three big things for today. Obviously, it's the King's Speech, the day that Keir Starmer lays out his legislative programme for the year or so ahead. We'll be talking about that. As Sam says, we'll be talking again about American politics because it's such a big story, the RNC convention this week. Boris Johnson has popped up there with a bit of a surprise, so we'll talk about that too. And of course, we'll be talking about the Tory leadership contest, as I suspect we will be for weeks and months. The latest on that, with people now starting to actually enter the race, even though the race hasn't actually started yet. So we'll be getting onto that at the end. But let's start with the King's Speech. Sam, let me just talk you through some of the mental things that happened before we this morning, before we actually get into what the government is going to be announcing today. Charles goes down through London in his horse-drawn carriage. He changes into ceremonial robes and a state crown. Some House of Commons officials have to go and ceremoniously search for gunpowder all around the estate just in case someone is planning a Guy Fawkes style event. And they've done that every year ever since 1600 whatever it was. That we have Black Rod hammering on the door of the House of Commons, summoning MPs down to the Lords. They all march through. Well, I say they all march through. Only a few of them actually get in because the House of Lords isn't that big. But we'll get to see Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak wandering through the estate together, chatting. Slightly awkward conversation, you'd imagine. These things sometimes are. And we won't get to hear what they say, but we'll get to watch that. And then the King, who has his own entrance to the House of Lords, he has his own throne in the House of Lords, will stand up and read out the government's legislative agenda for the year. And we are going to hear 30-something bills and draft bills, which are essentially Keir Starmer's big priorities for the next 12 months or so.
So the King will take his throne in the Lords at 11:30, and the speech that we're waiting for, that takes place at 11:40. And then there's a bit of a hiatus, and MPs start debating it this afternoon. And I, for one, am looking forward to the King doing his best Keir Starmer impression, Jack, talking about missions and first steps and delivery and, of course, growth.
His father definitely wasn't a toolmaker, though, was he? Just to be clear.
No, you'll have seen the great meme of Prince William going, no, my father wasn't at all over the last 24 hours. No, growth it is. Now is the time to take the brakes off Britain is the soundbite that's made it onto a lot of the front pages. Keir Starmer will say that this King's Speech is for too long people have been held back, their paths determined by where they came from, not their talents and hard work. And it's going to be a Queen... I did it again. It's a King's Speech. This is a King's Speech that is in large part so about pushing growth and in particular planning. And the soundbite on the front page of the Mail, it's going to be how, not if, homes and infrastructure is built. So that's the takeaway from what they want. But Jack, how much does this actually matter?
I think the planning reform measures are going to be a very big ongoing story for this government. I know you've been a bit sceptical about how much they're actually going to change. I think imposing top-down housing targets on local areas and removing people's opportunity, or at least reducing people's opportunity to protest against them or stop them, is going to kick off massively all over England as it slowly pans out. It's not going to happen today or tomorrow when they announce it because it's all a bit high level at the moment. But as that filters down, as local councils start going, right, then we have to find places for 30,000 homes in this town by the end of the month, or whatever harsh deadline Starmer and co are giving them, then all around the country we are going to see these big developments being announced on, frankly, on green fields that people don't want housing on who live around there. And every Labour MP is going to have a massive fight on their hands trying to explain to local residents why this is an essential part of Britain's kick for growth, and sorry, you're going to have to lose this land around where you live. And however much Labour say, well, we're going to build on brownfield sites and old petrol stations, stuff like that, of course there is some of that is going to happen. But the sorts of housing numbers they are talking about, which, all the stats show the country does need, are going to cause massive problems. And I just think back to Andy Burnham a few years ago having a total war on his hands in Greater Manchester when there was a sort of attempt to impose housing targets on some of the boroughs there, and he ended up, that all ended up getting scrapped in the end, or at least watered right down. I think we're going to see that playing out a lot around the country, and it's very easy if you're the opposition just to say that, well, this is a bad idea, we support housing, but not this development, not that development. And I think it's going to be a real opportunity for Tories and maybe Lib Dems too in local areas to really push back against the government.
I mean, clearly, we're just going to have to wait and see the scale of the fight that all the planning reforms trigger. But I suppose I've got a sort of different view overall on this, because as you say, as you acknowledge, we have actually talked about the planning reforms today, and I think there's almost a sort of bigger question: is why does the King's Speech matter? Because in many ways, what you get today is just a sort of very antiquated, very ornate, very expensive press release. We knew that the Labour Party were going to put planning at the heart of their government agenda, and if you've been paying the slightest bit of attention, actually, I think there are often very few surprises on King's Speech Day, bits and pieces of legislation that you didn't know were coming down the track. I mean, if you remember the last time we had a King's Speech, there was a row over whether or not they were going to take away tents from homeless people. But if you had even glanced at the Labour manifesto or heard any of the campaign speeches, I think much of what's coming down the track will feel familiar. Just a couple of things to look for. The most important thing if you want to sort of find out what's new in a King's Speech, look for the division between the bills, because there'll be a list of bills that they're planning to introduce, about which we'll get a little bit of detail, but not a huge amount, and the draft bills. And why that matters, the one thing you do learn on King's Speech Day is what they've decided to go slow on. So the first thing I tend to look at is the bottom of the contents page to see what they don't think is the immediate priority compared to the things that they need to run through. You do get a sense, a bit more of a sense of what Starmerism will look like, though. What's very striking is just how enthusiastic so many of the different bills are on increasing the role of the state in all sorts of different bits of our lives, whether it's taking back control of the railways into public ownership in England, those that aren't already, whether it is ensuring that there is actually a nationalisation plan for buses, more central control on education, or on GB Energy, which is going to invest in green energy projects alongside the private sector. This is a big expansion in the role of the state. So that's very, very different to anything we had for the last 14 years. But I think it's also a bit different to what we had with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Because if Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were more or less happy to splash the cash when it came to big projects, they were still a bit wary of anything that sort of smacked of too much sort of central interference, government interference in people's lives. But in many ways, I feel like Starmerism is the reverse. There ain't much money, but he is comfortable with a much, much bigger role of the state. So perhaps actually what today does more than anything else is help define what kind of Keir Starmer and his general philosophy is all about.
It's worth noting that policies like bringing the railways back into public ownership are enormously popular if you poll them, like overwhelmingly popular if you poll them. And so setting up Great British Railways and some of the measures they're talking about doing, making ticketing much more straightforward, making refunds much more straightforward, or, in theory ought to be really popular. And maybe they will be. I do think as well, though, there's a pretty big risk here with taking our railways, putting a big stamp, Great British Railways, on them, and essentially taking ownership and responsibility for what happens on them. If our railways don't get better and people still find themselves packed into awful carriages and unable to get onto trains because they're so full and stuck in, waiting hours for trains that don't turn up and all the stuff that we know has been happening for years, if that carries on, suddenly this is Keir Starmer's fault and Keir Starmer's problem, and that is a big risk. Equally, if it gets better and it has these shiny Great British Railway stamps on it, then, he can reap all the rewards for that. But it's far from a given that that's going to happen. And I do think, the ability just to point at a private company and say, yeah, well, it's this awful, evil, foreign-owned company that's messed the railways up, does make things politically easier than this might do for Keir Starmer long term.
Let's just look at one company, Avanti West Coast. That's the train company that connects London to Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool and Glasgow. That company cancelled 7% of its trains over the past year. Is that figure going to get better under Labour? Is it going to get better under Labour in this Parliament? It's hard to know, but without a great deal of money, it's hard to see.
Except that when other lines have been taken into public ownership because their contracts have failed, they have often got better. That is a fact. And so it is possible that, yes, indeed, this will also do that. But it's a risk, I would say. It's a risk. And similarly, GB Energy, lovely to put this big government branded thing on it. People feel patriotic and get behind it. But it's got to work. It's got to do what it says it's going to do, or you take the blame and the responsibility for it as a government.
And that's something that's modelled on Scandinavian state-owned energy companies, and they want to sort of import a bit of that vibe. But the point about the Scandinavian equivalents is that they have hundreds and hundreds of billions of pounds to invest, and I think the budget for GB Energy is a fraction of that. It's sort of 6-7 billion. So quite what the difference is that GB Energy is going to make is actually sort of puzzling some in the sort of environmental sector. Anyway, it's not the only thing happening today. Keir Starmer has a big meeting.
Yeah, after he's watched the King announce his speech, he heads back to the Commons and speaks in the Commons. We have these weird, jokey speeches in the Commons this afternoon before it gets onto the slightly more serious stuff. But if you're a fan of politicians making funny speeches, quote unquote, then you'll see lots of that in the Commons today. But then once he's done with that, Starmer heads off to Chequers and he's hosting the Irish PM Simon Harris tonight, ahead of tomorrow's European Political Community Summit, when we're getting 40-odd European leaders here in the UK for a one-day meeting. That's quite a big moment, of course, for Starmer, because he's trying to, quote unquote, reset relations with Europe, and Ireland is obviously our closest, one of our most important neighbours, certainly when it comes to dealing with post-Brexit issues, and so that's a relationship that needs to work. And it's a new young Prime Minister who'll be coming over, and I don't know if they've met before, but I certainly think it's a big deal for Keir Starmer, not least because much has been made already of the fact that so many people around Keir Starmer are either Irish or have Irish heritage. They sort of get Ireland. This Labour Party in a way that isn't always the case with British political parties.
That's right. Morgan McSweeney was born and brought up outside Cork. He was the campaign manager. Pat McFadden, who seems to be running government from the Cabinet Office, was the son of parents who emigrated from Donegal, and Sue Gray, who ran the finance ministry in Northern Ireland. Her Belfast parents moved to London in the 50s. Worth just quickly noting about Sue Gray, a curious story in the Times, that she has been personally getting involved in the case of a government bailout for a dilapidated Gaelic Games venue due to host the 2028 European Football Championships, Casement Park. This is quite a divisive project. I think it's not liked by unionists. It's championed by nationalists and Sinn Féin. And Sue Gray appears to have picked a side in favour of a bailout. And this has been going down clearly badly with some officials, some ministers, according to the Times. Curiously, Downing Street last night weren't denying the story. They were saying it was overblown. But two things strike you. First of all, that an aide, rather than an aide on behalf of a minister, should be interfering in a project is unusual and will cause some discomfort. And secondly, just the fact that this all-powerful person at Keir Starmer's side is coming under attack like this and being briefed against to the papers like this so quickly, I think will also be a matter of some discomfort. Keir Starmer doesn't like that kind of thing.
Let's talk about America, Sam, because nothing is going to matter more to Keir Starmer's term in power than if Donald Trump comes to the White House, and the Republican National Convention is continuing in Milwaukee today. And who should pop up there last night, unexpectedly, but Boris Johnson tweeting a picture of himself and Donald Trump, thumbs up, blonde hair glowing, or both blonde hairs glowing in the breeze, saying how they've had a nice chat in Milwaukee, and talking about Ukraine as well, which is a pretty interesting thing for Boris Johnson to be talking to Donald Trump about, don't you reckon?
That's right, particularly after the vice presidential pick that we talked about 24 hours ago. According to Boris Johnson, he said, "We discussed Ukraine at length, and I know that he will give the strong and decisive leadership necessary to protect democracy against aggression." Boris Johnson trying to put his stamp on this and sort of kind of trying to help the West, I suppose, and certainly European NATO allies who are very worried about the direction that Trump might take the Ukraine conflict in if he gets into power. But I have to say, Jack, what do we think Boris Johnson's goal is here? He always has an agenda. Why is he popping up like this, just as he popped up on the eve of the election? Not next to Rishi Sunak, but at the same event of him. He clearly wants to get his face about. What are his political sort of goals anymore, do we think?
Could it be possibly that Boris Johnson just really believes in Ukraine and is trying to do the right thing? Sorry, just let me wash my mouth out. I genuinely think that might be possible, even as someone as cynical as me, because Boris Johnson has actually been doing this for years. Since he left office, Boris Johnson has been heading over to America for private dinners with Republican Party grandees and donors and talking to them about Ukraine, because he has seen this moment coming down the track, and he genuinely believes he might be able to whisper into the ears of people who matter in the Republican Party and try and stop them doing what everyone in Europe fears they're going to do if they get back into power, and pull the plug on the Ukraine war. And Boris Johnson is one of the few people who has credibility in Republican circles, who Trump will listen to and likes and respects, but who also feels very, very strongly about the Ukraine war and that we should keep supporting it. Unlike Nigel Farage, who also has Trump's ear, but as we know is much more sympathetic. Or not sympathetic to the Ukraine cause, I should say. And so actually, Boris Johnson, this is just a part of a long game that Boris Johnson has been playing. Whether he can actually get through to Trump is another matter. Trump gave an interview to Bloomberg overnight where he told them that he doesn't love sanctions against Russia, which is not indicative of someone planning to take a hard line on Russia. So he also said, just listen to this from Donald Trump, when asked about whether he would protect Taiwan from Chinese aggression, he replied, "Taiwan is 9,500 miles away. It's 68 miles away from China." That is the sort of seismic geopolitical change that could be coming to the world at the end of the year. I just wanted to flag one other thing from the RNC as well, Sam, because I think this is really interesting. Donald Trump Jr. saying his dad is, quote, "a changed man," following what happened on Saturday. There are events that change you permanently. Things like this do actually change people. Is Donald Trump going to be different after what happened? I sort of got this image of, like Samuel Jackson in Pulp Fiction, when, the guy tries to shoot him and he misses, and then he finds God and he's this completely different character. There are people around Donald Trump saying he is a very different person after what happened on Saturday. So who knows what Trump is going to emerge when he speaks at the RNC on Thursday. Only other thing to watch out for, just to finish from Milwaukee, Sam, J.D. Vance, the vice presidential pick, is expected to speak tonight overnight for his big speech, and everyone will obviously now be watching that very closely, given how important a figure he has suddenly become.
Already seeing headlines about him running for president in 2028. Talking of contests, the Tory leadership contest is underway, so we've got to talk about the Tories for our statutory 2 minutes. It seems that Priti Patel is about to launch her candidacy for that in the next week or so. She will be she's going to make a pitch to be a unity candidate, but whether or not unity candidates work or just fall foul of both wings of the Conservative Party remains to be seen. Tom Tugendhat has also indicated that he's going to run. He will be a candidate more of the centre or the One Nation wing. He was addressing people from the centrist Tory Reform group just last night. But I think the job of all the different candidates at the moment is to see if that they can do something to dent the small but noticeable lead of Kemi Badenoch, who's currently the front runner in this contest. It strikes me that she hasn't got an impregnable lead, so that's not an impossible task. But we're waiting tomorrow to get the timetable before we get more of a sense and quite how. I think the right are going to come for Kemi Badenoch in particular, which is one of the reasons why they want conference in order to quote unquote showcase people's talents, which is another way that people try and get at front runners by trying to sort of undermine their reputation. So I think there's quite a long way to go on that.
I think it's important to say as well, when we're talking about a front runner, we're basically talking about polling of Tory party members, i.e. the people that will vote on the final two. And you're absolutely right that what we know so far suggests that Kemi Badenoch is way out in front among Tory party members. But, of course, the Tory contest typically involves Tory MPs whittling the contest down to two people, and then the Tory members get a vote. So Kemi Badenoch is only the front runner if she can get herself into the final two, and that means building a coalition of Tory MPs, the remaining Tory MPs, getting them on board and getting her into that position. If she can't do that, it doesn't matter how many Tory members like you. Typically, there'll be a contestant from the right and a contestant from the centre, and so Kemi Badenoch needs to beat off a challenge from Suella Braverman, from Priti Patel, and whoever else, Robert Jenrick, I guess, to be that person. And if she can't do that, it doesn't really matter how popular within the grassroots she is.
In the last few seconds, we've just had this morning's inflation figures. They've come in at 2%, which is the Bank of England's target. It's a tiny bit hotter than forecasts were hoping for and expecting, but it's nothing like the problematic levels that we had when Rishi Sunak took over from Liz Truss in the months that followed. Inflation is a problem for everyone, but pretty much steady, I think. So no big change there.
There you go. Breaking news on a podcast. Don't you love it? Just as we finish, and now you know what time it is. It's just gone 7 a.m. on Wednesday, and we're going to call it a day. Sam, enjoy the King's speech, enjoy the crown and the robes and all the nonsense, and I'll see you tomorrow.
See you then. Bye-bye.